I was a business designer, which is probably the coolest designation that I've had.
No, you can't afford a cappuccino.
Yeah,
What do you need to do?
Yeah.
You might get a sasta coffee machine.
Because eventually, if you're not a techie or even if you're techie,
yeah,
you can build a product when you're 25.
correct.
But before you build that product, you need that mindset.
Yeah, Adi, why don't you give us a snapshot about who you are and where you come from?
Yeah, no, delighted to be here and look forward to this conversation. My career has been quite all over the place, sometimes as I think it should be. I started out as a teacher. That was my first job, full-time, grade 4 and 5. It actually till date is the best job that I've done. I just deeply enjoyed it. This was in Bombay. So did that for about a couple of years. Was in education for some time. 4 saal mein education mein tha, so I was in education for 4 years. Then I moved to the US, studied public policy at Harvard, which was great. In the middle of my master's, had a chance to go to Jordan and work with the Queen's team in Amman, which was fascinating. And they were building a teacher training policy for Jordan at that time. And it was great, just a really hardcore sort of public policy experience. Came back to the Kennedy School, which is where I went, which is, the Harvard Kennedy School. Went into impact investing for about 2.5 years after that at Draper Richards Kaplan, which is Bill Draper, Tim Draper, same sort of family. They've got an impact investment fund. So did that. And then I had a really interesting manager at DRK who was like, look, man, you're like 28. And there's entrepreneurs that are much older than you and much more experienced than you that are just listening to some faltu gyan you're giving them. And because you haven't built a company, you've never been an operator, you don't know what it feels like to hire a team, to fire a team. But because you hold the gateway to a significant number of US dollars, people will listen to you and people will be like, wow, kya baat boli yaar aapne, sahi hai, hame yahi karna chahiye. But I just think that, most people at DRK, in fact, a lot of the associates that I worked with, all went on to become entrepreneurs because that's what DRK encouraged. Ki ye kar lo aap, do it for 2 or 3 years, but then go on and do your own thing. And whether you succeed or fail, that's fine. But at least you'll have some lived experience. And then you come back into sort of, investing. So started a AI company. We actually started in EdTech, Akash and I. So we built Hushl. That was the company that I started with.
But interestingly, you had a stint at IDEO before that as well, right?
Correct, I did. So between DRK and Hushl, I was at IDEO, which is a product design firm. And I had, again, a very interesting role there. I was a business designer, which is probably the coolest designation that, I've had. It's one of those, whatever, BS designations, but you're a business designer. The role there was, so IDEO is a hardcore design team. And what often happens with designers is that they get really passionate about the beauty, the aesthetics, the desirability of the product. And we used to do both hardware as well as software. And the client would be thrilled. They'd be like, wow, what a product. And we'd sort of launch it and customers would love it. But there isn't enough business thinking that's gone into the product. And so, if you built a solar lamp, you haven't thought through the value chain, you haven't thought through the supply chain, and so you do it in a lab and then you give it to a client. And so they needed someone, especially because we were doing a lot of fintech work. At that time, you actually need someone who understands just, debt and numbers and, is able to look at, financials and in a certain way.
And so all for Africa.
Correct. So the studio was in Nairobi.
Okay.
Wow.
And so I had an all Kenyan team. And so I was the only sort of, Indian guy there. And the culture of IDEO and in general of the startups and, other folks that I met in Nairobi is damn good. Yeah. I feel like they are people that generalize kar raha hoon, but I feel like they're people that take their work seriously, but they don't take themselves seriously. It's a very jolly culture, And so that was delightful. And you need that when you have a design studio. You need a little bit of banter and there's some creativity that needs to be in the air.
Right.
So did that and so understood how products work really well. And so teamed up with Akash, got into Entrepreneur First. So quit IDEO when I got into Entrepreneur First. This was their 7th cohort in Bangalore. Met Akash on day 1. We started out in EdTech because my passion was in education and sort of still remains in education. It's a sector I feel strongly about. We spoke to a couple of investors who said EdTech and all is dead, boss. कोई तुमको पैसा वैसा नहीं देने वाला है. Good. अच्छा है तुम.
Yeah, that is like post 2022, I presume, right?
This was in 2022.
yeah.
This was in 2022. They were like 4 years ago, was probably the right time. But like, देख लो आप लोग EdTech में करना है नहीं करना है. And so we were also first time entrepreneurs. And so we said, okay. And so then we sort of pivoted and went into AI and then went into creator economy and explored a few other sort of spaces. Built a really nice product that was at the intersection of AI and marketing, launched it, got about 7,000 users. And this was pre-ChatGPT. And then the day that ChatGPT launched, Akash and I were just on the phone, like on that one phone call went on for like 6.5 hours. "Ye kya bana diya, bhai?" Because at that time, nobody thought they would go into, like now it's common knowledge, right? Like you think of ChatGPT and OpenAI, but at that time, you didn't think they were going into consumer applications. And so then they did, and so then we pivoted, and now we're an AI services company. So I did that.
So as a founder, operator, there's always so much that is unknown, right?
Yeah.
And you don't even know you don't know about.
Yeah.
So how do you handle that? Do you have a framework saying कि यार मुझे पता नहीं क्या होने वाला है, but I'm always preparing yourself for it? Do you do something like that? Because I think most founders struggle with that.
Yeah, 100%. And it's, in fact, the conversation we were having before, right? Like, I guess as a first-time entrepreneur, मैं non-technical founder, so coding नहीं आता था, but I had a really sort of smart CTO with me, Akash. I knew product really well. And फिर मुझे लगा यार, especially if you work in corporate and all of that, ना आपको लगता है कि आप अच्छी अंग्रेजी बोल लेते हो, तो sales marketing तो हो, communication ही तो है ना भाई. Then when you jump into it was when you realize that, there's so many different aspects of it, like how you sell, and there's multiple different frameworks. So I think in my first sort of 6 months, that was a huge learning curve for me, which is that just the ability to speak or to communicate doesn't actually translate into like marketing or like sales or being able to like sell, right? Like you almost think there's like foundationally, yaar, hai cheeze main ye wo seekh jaunga, or you'll hire for it. But I don't think I had the ability to, as a 0 to 1 founder, your ability to sell is so important because you have nothing, yeah. You don't have a brand. Like now I just did a 1 to 10 because the education company that I was with has like 23 years of vintage. So their selling is so much easier. It's established, tumhare relationships hai, all of that. But when you do a 0 to 1 as a first time founder, I just think it's really hard. So at that time, I didn't even know ki kya unknowns hai. Like if there are 100 tasks that a founder needs to know, even legal. Like I feel like if you're an employee, आप employment contract कोई पढ़ता नहीं है, आप बस sign करके दे देते हो. But when you get investment terms, like you don't have the legalese to sort of read it or understand it. Even when you do sales contracts, वो आपको पता नहीं होता है. Performance marketing क्या चीज होती है, वो आपको सही तरीके से पता नहीं होता है. Like so, I think at that time the unknowns were many. I think now अभी मोटा framework है कि अच्छा ये 100 चीजें हैं अलग-अलग. These are the different things that one needs to know, and these are the things that I know. These are the things I have networks for, and these are a few things that I may not sort of know or have access to. But I don't know if I have or if I had a framework at that time, or if anyone showed me a framework. Like I wish at some point somebody just said, buddy, you're a first-time entrepreneur. Here's 100 things you need to know, right? And I think you and your co-founder know 65 of these, and then these you don't know.
What are the gaps?
And these are the gaps. And I think Antler does a reasonable job of this.
Okay.
They have a framework where I think they get, I think one of the things, because a couple of my friends are, Antler's invested in them, and I speak to them a lot. And I think Vignesh from Hexo was telling me that, when they came together, one is I think Antler doesn't say that you need the traditional CEO, CTO. For every company, sometimes you need 3 co-founders.
Yeah.
Sometimes you need 1. You just have to figure out what your gaps are, right?
Exactly.
Like it's not that traditional thing. So I think there's a lot of value in helping first-time founders understand what they know and what they don't know. And I wish there was a framework.
So I have a very interesting lead-up question, Adi. I mean, I've always talked to people and asked them, hey, number one, do you work for somebody else as a company before you start your entrepreneurship journey?
Yeah.
That's the first question.
Yeah.
The second question is, do I start a product company straight up?
Yeah.
Or do I start a services company?
Yeah.
Or selling, monetizing your skills?
Yeah.
right? These two questions are probably going to add value for a lot of founders out there, right?
Yeah.
How would you think about it?
This is a great question. And I think that it depends. So, one is on your first question, which is, do you work for someone else before you start your own? I think it goes either way because, to your point, if you worked for IBM for like 15 years, um, to your point, you have to unlearn so much. And that unlearning first requires you to really drop your ego, which doesn't happen because you've just been so valued at a corporate firm and you're very used to, I have seen employees are very used to working with resources.
Right, right.
Suddenly, aapke paas resource, like what is being entrepreneurial, right? Entrepreneurial is the ability to be resourceful. At IBM, you don't have to be resourceful. You just have 9 baje aap show up karo. You have to be intellectually smart, but so much of entrepreneurship is just being street smart or like dunyadari. So I think that's like
So I have a test that I give some people who come to me, and it's called a stinky toilet test. And why I don't call it a stinky toilet test is because as a executive 10 years, 15 years experience, you used to flying business class using lounges. As an entrepreneur, you're at the back of the plane right next to the stinky toilet.
Yeah.
Can you do that for a 15-hour flight or an 8-hour flight? It's a very simple test. If you can't pass that test, you're not allowed to be an entrepreneur.
Right, right.
It's a very simple thing, Pushkar, but those are, and I know tons of entrepreneurs who have slept in airport lounges because they couldn't afford a hotel or all of that. That sacrifice, nobody talks about it. But that's a big sacrifice to being a founder.
Yeah.
No, back to...
So I would say, I'm thinking of this, I'm thinking out loud as I answer your question. I think big brands, I think are sometimes almost liabilities, especially big mammoth corporates or even like Ivy League degrees and things like that, right? Like abhi to mujhe lagta hai ki thoda bahut liability hota hai in terms of, because you have to unlearn so much and I feel like you have to truly drop your ego. So I feel like if you have relevant experience at a startup, if you worked in the early stages of Paytm or PhonePe or whatever it is, or Zomato, and you've seen it sort of grow up and then you go and start something, I think that's solid. I feel like that's the best thing. Corporate, agar aap Infosys में काम करते हैं, Wipro में काम करते हैं, अपने Ivy League में कुछ पढ़ा है, like I almost think that's either not as relevant or almost थोड़ा बहुत liability हो जाता है मुझे लगता है, you know, in some ways, because that unlearning process I think has to happen. I mean, I also think so much of entrepreneurship is stamina, right? You're not going to get it right the first time. I feel like, so you have to have the ability to keep going at it and you have to allow yourself 5 to 7 failures, right? Before you hit it. I think there are two kinds of phases in life where this makes sense. One is, I think, really early where you have nothing to lose. You're like 21, 22, 23. आपके पास है ही नहीं कुछ खोने के लिए, right? Like you have no dependencies. So I think that that's a nice place to go at it. And then I think when you've saved up a reasonable enough corpus and then you sort of want to go at it. So I don't have a straight answer to your question. What I will say is I think the big brands sometimes become a liability. I think early stage startup experience is great. You've been part of like a founding team or even Series A,
So you've been part of chaos and you understand what didn't work there and what really worked there well.
Yeah.
So you use that as a framework to, this works, this doesn't work.
Right.
And product versus services? No, we're not putting you in a spot, but it's just that
I do services, first. Again, I think depends on case to case and which sector you're in and what's the background that you come in with. Aap hardware karna chahte ho, software karna chahte ho. I think in general, again, and I speak from a non-technical founder, right? Like business founders, sort of that CEO experience. There, I really think it's very useful to have run a business before you do entrepreneurship. Again, I think it's tricky, because sometimes the rules are different, right? Like, again, there is an unlearning that happens. I spent this entire year in Ahmedabad. And Ahmedabad is as hardcore dhando as it gets, right? Like they're very like old school business
of business in India.
And you learn so much from the people that are there that now adds to what I will bring in. But there's also a bunch of things that they do that are not very relevant anymore.
That's right.
Like there's a little bit of a mix. So I don't know if there's a straight answer. I think it depends on the person. I think it does depend on what product in what sector. But generally, I think having run some business, like I really like these founders who are like, college mein maine sneakers beche, ya main assessments bechta tha, ya that sort of
once you understand the whole cycle of money and how to put the right people, what you're good at, what you're not good at, outsource something.
Correct.
In any business, you will learn that, right?
How did you develop your passion?
बहुत luck से हो गया यहाँ वहाँ थोड़ा बहुत
Because of studies or you met someone?
It's a nice question. For me, it was exposure. Like
What
when
is
I saw
invariably
that-
asking you is, did you date a lot of teachers?
Yeah, but if you did, maybe
No, I did.
Teach for India. 5 teachers. No, we'll cut this part.
No, it's all good. I think the communications internship, when I saw something and something just clicked for me कि ये हो रहा है Teach for India में, I think that was, I feel like, I mean, it's interesting. For some people it comes, I'm trying to think of where do you recognize your passion. One is कि दोस्तों से आता है कि ये दोस्त कर रहा है, so आपकी exposure वहाँ से हो गई. Like, you know, you're like, oh, you're also doing it, you know, you sort of go there. It's mostly just trial, which is why I think in college and in your teenage years, you should just try 25 things. You'll find passion in 1, 2, 3 of
It's
them.
a great way of putting it.
Somewhere.
Exactly.
You try a lot of things.
Just go all out.
Especially when you're young.
Especially when you're young, because again, in those years, you have truly nothing to lose yet.
Yeah.
Like
There's no downside.
no downside to it. है ही नहीं यार, तुम्हारी जेब में पैसे ही नहीं है.
Right.
क्या ही होगा ना, मतलब from like at least 14 to like 22, 23 are golden years to just, you know, just explore a bunch of things and like, and you don't need money. When I say exposure, it doesn't mean you have to travel to like Japan or like whatever it is. Just around, try different things. So I feel like you find that. The curiosity thing is interesting because I have a deep interest in healthcare. And it comes from curiosity. I'm just really interested in all sorts of things, right? Like what is Peter Attia saying? What's Andrew Huberman saying? What's Marcus Rane saying? So I feel like it was first curiosity over there. Ki creatine se kya hota hai? Like what does creatine do for like South Asian bodies? What does magnesium do? So I feel like it was curiosity. And now I sort of feel passionately about it. But in education, it's the other way around.
Brands like Ixigo and other guys have been able to do it at scale.
Yeah.
So I think we're still about 5-10 years out to really see those brands come in and make that breakthrough to go on to be either publicly listed companies or get acquired by the large, either global or Indian consumer MNCs.
Right.
At least that's my take on the situation.
Especially in consumer sector.
Yeah, in the consumer sector.
Relevant for consumer sector.
You need that inherent virality.
Yeah, exactly.
In your product, which I think exists in like beauty, cosmetics. Like there's some inherent virality. I think speaking to someone about just healthcare in general, like even in healthcare, the plays that work, they allow for some status signaling.
Yeah.
You know, like I think those are the products that really work. So I think there's inherent virality, especially just in this content age that we're in, is so big. It's such a filter when you think of like consumer ideas. Inherent virality, word of mouth.
Because that's the best form, right? If you can create great, solid content, but at the same time, your product. Exactly. So that is what I was going to say. You need to still have an 8 on 10 or a 9 on 10 product.
Yeah.
Backed by solid content, solid packaging, solid design.
Right.
That's
Which I think the whole truth does really well.
whole truth is done really well.
Like I think I really like what they do and just, you know,
Soul Store has done a good job of it,
Yeah.
though they're offline. So,
Correct.
I mean, there are brands that are coming about in India, but
So this is what you said. The US guys do it really well, right?
yeah.
At least on the design part. I don't know why, because
design का बहुत अच्छा है.
we somehow like the design aesthetic.
Japan, Scandinavia, US, वो design का थोड़ा अलग level पे है ना.
Because Europe, we don't read design. We don't study design at school. We don't really have good designs.
And we have one institution, yeah. We have NID. Bangalore में सृष्टि है.
Can I talk about something really controversial? I think we're not very good at design because the general lack of curiosity is actually very low.
Could be.
How do you actually build good design? Because, I mean, we're going to be talking to Vyasa as well later, but good design is essentially based on you understanding various patterns, you consuming a lot of information, and then contextually you're looking at a problem and saying, what do I need to pull out and put in there and then sharpen the axe?
Yeah.
So I think fundamentally we as a culture, we are forced into these tracks where we are horses on blinders.
Yeah.
We don't have that spread purview. Like, हम लोग जो बात किए थे ना, by the time you're 22, 23, 24, have you done 20 different things? Which makes you curious and passionate about 2 things.
Culturally, maybe we're not equipped to create good design because you just look at the buildings or the layouts or anything that we design.
Yeah.
We do very functional stuff.
Yeah.
In India, it's a way this like, it has to work.
Yeah.
It need not look good.
Correct.
But do you think this also comes because maybe our culture doesn't have a lot of risk appetite?
Yeah.
We don't want to make bold bets.
Yeah.
They just like, because see, if you're building a building
Yeah.
which is very conservative, it will sell, right?
Yeah.
And you also spend less money on it.
Correct.
So we are always thinking that, hey, let's protect our downside.
Correct.
And in doing that, we maybe don't chase the really upside. Is that a cultural thing?
I think so. It comes back to that frugality wala point, right? Which is functional wala bhai cheez. Matlab efficiency chahiye, you know, like just get this built, you know, wo sasta tikao.
Exactly.
Once you were into sasta tikao, jugaad, right? Like, it's holding back. So this is what's holding back. But if you see, right, like I think in terms of like, if you actually look at like local Indian design, like if you look at like a Kashmiri Pashmina
Pasmina.
look at like just what Rajasthan artisans do, like हमारे culture में है. It's just, I think, this modern design that has been taught to us, which is this whole, like, I also have this whole thing of how I think UI UX को ना हमने बहुत मतलब product design को एकदम मतलब modular बना दिया है, चिपका दिया है कि भाई ये बटन है, ये यहाँ पे ये है, मतलब 10 हफ्ते में तुमको सिखा देंगे, अब तुम डिजाइनर हो, and you're like भाई मैं डिजाइनर हूँ, but तुमको बस वो फिग्मा में तुम मोबाइल स्क्रीन बना सकते हो, and that's good, it's a starting point, but design goes so deep, man. Like I almost these days find graphic designers को ना इतना पैसा नहीं मिलता compared to like product designers or UI UX designers. Again, within that you've got UX designers that are supposed to think differently than you've got UI. I just feel like I enjoy these days speaking to these graphic designers who just have a sense of like creativity that's a lot deeper, rather than these modern institute ke, you know, UI designers, or even UX is also just so much of it is just like consumer insight, and it takes a while, you know. Like you have to speak to a lot of consumers, like it's very chaotic, like उसको भी ना हमने एकदम मॉड्यूलर 10 लोगों से बात करो, ये इनसाइट निकालो, एक अच्छी पीपीटी में दिखाओ और तुमने क्लाइंट को दिखा दिया कि ये लो सर आपका कंज्यूमर इनसाइट. नहीं है यार, ऐसे थोड़ी होता है.
Yeah, exactly.
You have to be a designer. You know, I feel like we've lost that essence.
Eddie,
Thank you.
lovely. Thank you for your time.
Thank you. Thank you very much for having me, and hope to build something together. Thank you.
Thank you.
To make one more mention of Bhive, who've been an absolutely amazing host for this podcast series. Thank you so much, guys, for your space. They've got a lot of new spaces in Bangalore. Please feel free to check it out.